The arrow missed by inches. 22-year-old Tsar Ivan IV stood at the edge of his military camp on a rain-soaked August morning in 1552, watching smoke rise from the wooden walls of Kazan. Behind those fortifications sat 10,000 Tatar horsemen, the last major fragment of the Mongol Golden Horde that had terrorized Russia for centuries. They just fired a volley at his command tent. For generations, the Khanate of Kazan had raided Muscovy for slaves and plunder, dragging tens of thousands of Russians into bondage in Persian and Turkish markets. Ivan's grandfather had tried to conquer them. His father had tried. Both failed. Now it was his turn. And if he failed, he'd lose more than a battle. He'd lose the throne, his legitimacy, maybe his life. The boyars who'd tormented him as an orphan child were already whispering about his weakness. This is the story of how a traumatized young ruler transformed personal rage into imperial conquest, breaking a 300-year cycle of terror in one relentless, 6-week campaign. By the end, you'll understand why this moment didn't just change Ivan. It birthed an empire that would stretch to the Pacific Ocean. To understand what Ivan brought to Kazan's walls, you need to understand what was taken from him. When Ivan was 3 years old, his father died from an infected sore on his thigh. His mother, Elena, took control as regent. She successfully ruled Russia for 4 years until she died suddenly in 1538, apparently from poisoning, leaving 8-year-old Ivan an orphan. The boyars, Russia's feudal nobles, descended like vultures. These weren't guardians. They were predators in silk robes. Historical accounts describe young Ivan and his brother being neglected, sometimes deprived of food, while the aristocrats plundered the treasury and fought for power. Ivan was described as intelligent and devout, but also prone to paranoia, rage, and episodic outbreaks of mental instability, traits that likely began in those formative years of abuse and abandonment. At 16, Ivan did something unprecedented. He called an assembly and declared himself not just Grand Prince, but Tsar, Emperor of all Russia. The boyars had no choice but to crown him. And he remembered everything they'd done. But there was another enemy that demanded his attention first, Kazan. The city sat 400 miles southeast of Moscow on the Volga River, perched on a hill behind wooden walls and a deep moat. The Khanate of Kazan had emerged from the disintegration of the Golden Horde and controlled several important trade routes and the passes through the Urals into Siberia. Here's what most people don't realize about this conflict. It wasn't just about territory. It was about human flesh. For over a century, Tatar raiders from Kazan had swept into Russian villages like clockwork, burning homes, killing resistors, and dragging survivors south in chains. Russians who had been captured in military campaigns from the Russian borderland were held captive in the Khanate, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 of them by 1552. These weren't prisoners of war. They were merchandise. Young Russian women fetched high prices in Constantinople. Strong men became galley slaves or field laborers. Children were raised as Muslims, never knowing their families. Every raid hemorrhaged Russia's population and economy, creating ghost villages across the frontier. Ivan had tried diplomacy. He'd installed puppet khans. All had failed. During the existence of the Khanate, Russian forces besieged Kazan at least 10 times. Every attempt had ended in retreat, starvation, or humiliation. Now, in the summer of 1552, Ivan assembled something Russia had never fielded before, a modern army. In August 1552, the young Tsar led a Russian army, perhaps 150,000 strong, to besiege Kazan. But numbers alone weren't revolutionary. What made this force different was its composition. Ivan had created the streltsy, Russia's first standing professional infantry armed with arquebus, an early type of musket. Unlike feudal levies who showed up when summoned and left when harvest season called, these men were career soldiers. They drilled. They practiced. They followed orders. He brought 150 cannons, shipped piece by piece down the Volga on barges. Artillery wasn't new, but this concentration of firepower was unprecedented for a Russian campaign. The Russians had the advantage of efficient military engineers, such as Ivan Virodkov and an Englishman named Butler, who'd bring innovations that would horrify Kazan's defenders. But perhaps most tellingly, Ivan brought sappers, mining engineers, men who understood that walls could be bypassed not by climbing over them, but by going under them. The army that marched toward Kazan in June 1552 wasn't just bigger than previous attempts. It represented a fundamental shift in how Russia waged war, from medieval cavalry charges to early modern siege warfare. Still, nothing was guaranteed. The Tatars had repelled every previous assault, and the weather seemed determined to help them do it again. Storms and torrential rain blew down the Muscovite tents and turned their camp to mud. Imagine you're Ivan, watching your military encampment dissolve into a swamp. Soldiers huddle under collapsed canvas. Gunpowder stores are getting soaked. The wooden siege towers you've been building are sinking into mud. And from the walls of Kazan, you can hear the defenders laughing. This was put down to pagan magic, and a crucifix containing a fragment of the true cross was brought to the scene. There was no more bad weather after that. Whether divine intervention or coincidence, the storms stopped. But the psychological toll had been taken. Soldiers whispered about curses. Officers questioned whether God favored this campaign at all. Ivan had another problem. He was running out of time. It was already late August. In another month, maybe 6 weeks, the Russian winter would begin its approach. If he hadn't taken Kazan by then, he'd face the same choice as his predecessors: retreat in failure or freeze to death in the field. The defenders knew this. All they had to do was wait. Then Ivan tried something that revealed both his desperation and his darkness. When Tatar prisoners were tied to stakes close to the walls in the hope that their pleas might persuade the defenders to surrender, the Tatar bowmen silenced them by shooting them. Picture the scene. Russian soldiers drive wooden stakes into the ground within archery range of Kazan's walls. They bind Tatar prisoners, men they'd captured in earlier skirmishes, to these posts. The idea is to create a moral dilemma for the defenders. Hear your kinsmen beg for their lives, or surrender the city. Instead, Tatar archers on the walls draw their bows and shoot their own people to silence them. It's a ruthless calculus. Better a quick death than giving the enemy what they want. This moment tells you everything about what both sides were willing to endure. There would be no negotiated settlement. No honorable surrender. Someone was going to break, and it would be total. But Ivan had learned something from watching those men die. Walls and morale could only protect Kazan from the outside. What if he attacked from underneath? Sappers blew up the underground way to Kazan's underground drinking water source. This was psychological warfare elevated to an art form. Kazan's defenders woke one morning to find their wells producing nothing but mud. Underground, Russian miners had spent weeks tunneling beneath the city's fortifications, following the sound of flowing water. When they found the aquifer that fed Kazan's wells, they planted explosives and collapsed it. Now every cup of water inside the city became precious. Soldiers got thirsty. Civilians got desperate. The Tatars could see the Volga River from their walls, water flowing endlessly past, but they couldn't reach it without running a gauntlet of Russian crossbow bolts and cannon fire. But the sappers weren't done. They were simultaneously digging larger tunnels, placing them at strategic points beneath Kazan's walls. These weren't simple mines. They were underground chambers, each packed with barrels of gunpowder. Meanwhile, above ground, Russian engineer Ivan Virodkov was building something Kazan had never seen before. Ivan Virodkov built on site a 12-meter-high wooden siege tower that could hold 10 large-caliber cannon and 50 lighter cannon, allowing a concentration of artillery fire on a section of the earthen-filled wooden wall. Think about what this means. Previous sieges involved dragging cannons into position, firing a few shots, maybe making a dent in the wall. Defenders could repair damage overnight. But Virodkov's battery tower created a platform that could sustain concentrated fire on a single section of wall, pounding it relentlessly with 60 cannons at once. The tower went up piece by piece throughout September. Kazan's defenders watched it rise like a wooden mountain, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. They fired their own artillery at it, but they only had a handful of cannons. Russian cannons soon smothered the fire of large-caliber Tatar cannons. By late September, the thunder of Russian artillery was constant. Kazan's walls began to crack, then crumble. Defenders rushed to repair breaches with whatever materials they had: timbers, packed earth, furniture, even corpses. But the real attack was still coming from below. Dawn broke on October 2, 1552. Ivan gave the order. Sappers, believed to have been led by the Englishman Butler, blew up the wall near the Nogai and Adalik gates. The explosion didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like the earth screaming. Weeks of tunneling, tons of gunpowder, all detonated simultaneously under two sections of Kazan's defensive wall. The blast threw stone, timber, and human bodies hundreds of feet into the air. The concussion wave knocked Russian soldiers off their feet a quarter-mile away. When the dust settled, there were two massive breaches in Kazan's defenses. Ivan's soldiers poured through the gaps. The civil population as well as the army of Kazan opposed them. After desperate street fighting, some survivors were blockaded in the citadel. This wasn't a battle. It was slaughter in the streets. Russian infantry with arquebus faced Tatar defenders fighting with swords, bows, and desperation. Civilians joined the fight. Old men, women, anyone who could hold a weapon. Every alley became a killing ground. Every house a fortress. The fighting was so fierce that, according to contemporary accounts, Ivan himself continued in prayer for a victory close to the point of disgracing himself as a coward. He stayed in his command tent, on his knees before icons, while his soldiers fought and died in Kazan streets. Was he praying? Or was he paralyzed by fear that his grand gamble was about to fail? The Tatar defenders fell back to Kazan's inner citadel, a final fortified area within the city. After the capture of Khan Yadgar Maksamad and Nogai leader Zainesh, the defenders of the citadel tried to escape to the northern forests, but they were defeated. Here's what the official histories don't usually emphasize. This wasn't a clean military victory. When the citadel fell, a large massacre of Kazan Tatars took place, as well as the destruction of almost all Tatar buildings, including mosques. Russian soldiers who'd marched 400 miles, endured storms and disease, lost friends to Tatar arrows and mines. They didn't stop when the Khan surrendered. They'd been told for decades that Kazan was the source of their nation's suffering. Now they had the city at their mercy. Russian chronicles indicate over 100,000 captives taken from the city and surrounding territories, distributed as slaves to nobles, monasteries, and soldiers. The enslaved became enslavers. The cycle just reversed direction. But amid the horror, There was one detail that resonated with the Russian soldiers. 60,000 to 100,000 Russians who had been captured and held captive in the Khanate were released. Men and women who'd been torn from their homes years ago, some as children, stumbled out of captivity speaking a language they'd almost forgotten. This wasn't just conquest. For thousands of Russians, it was homecoming. Ivan returned to Moscow to a hero's welcome. Church bells rang across the city. Crowds lined the streets. He'd done what his grandfather and father couldn't, broken the Mongol grip on Russia's eastern frontier. The news came that his wife had borne him a son and heir, though the little boy did not live long. Even in triumph, Ivan couldn't escape tragedy. He celebrated the victory by commissioning St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square, its colorful onion domes unlike anything in traditional Russian architecture, a deliberate echo of the Eastern cultures he'd just conquered. It stands today, a monument to the moment Moscow became an empire. But the victory at Kazan came with a cost that would echo through centuries. In Kazan, the Muslim population was expelled and Russian colonists were moved in, mosques were replaced by Russian Orthodox churches, and the Tatars of the surrounding country were pressed to convert to Christianity. What began as military conquest became cultural erasure. The city that had been a center of Islamic learning and Turkic culture was methodically dismantled and rebuilt as a Russian provincial capital. The governor Alexander Gorbatyashvili led a terror campaign against the Tatars, forcing them to convert to Christianity or relocate 31 miles away from Kazan. And it didn't end with the fall of the city. After the fall of Kazan, resistance continued in the countryside. There was daily fighting in the snow and forests. 10,000 men were killed, 6,000 were captured along with 15,000 women and children. 1,600 leading Tatars were put to death. This guerrilla war would rage for 4 more years until 1556, turning the Volga region into a landscape of burned villages and mass graves. Here's where the story takes its darkest turn, not on the battlefield, but inside Ivan's mind. The conquest of Kazan changed him. Historians generally believe that in a fit of anger, he murdered his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, decades later. The paranoia that had been planted by childhood trauma and fertilized by the need to maintain absolute control would eventually consume him. But in the years immediately following Kazan, Ivan was on a roll. In 1556 the Russians went down the Volga and conquered the Khanate of Astrakhan. Then Siberia. Then beyond. The empire that began at Kazan's broken walls would eventually span 11 time zones. Russian historian Mark Galeotti, a specialist in this period, notes that Kazan was finally taken and brought directly into Muscovy's control, making it a truly multi-ethnic empire. This wasn't just territorial expansion, it was a fundamental transformation of what Russia was. For the first time, Orthodox Christian Russia absorbed significant populations of Muslims, Turkic peoples, and other cultures. The techniques Ivan used at Kazan, combining overwhelming firepower, siege engineering, and ruthless subjugation, became the template for Russian imperial expansion for the next 3 centuries. Here's the twist that recontextualizes everything we've just watched. Ivan's nickname, the Terrible, doesn't mean what you think it means. The Russian word is Grozny. The Russian word Grozny reflects the older English usage of terrible as in inspiring fear or terror, dangerous, powerful, similar to modern English terrifying or formidable. It means awe-inspiring. Formidable. Someone who commands respect through strength. The title was more or less an honor. In a world where there were many enemies of the Russian state, both inside and outside, the name of Terrible would indicate that you were not someone to be crossed. So when we call him Ivan the Terrible, We're using a translation that makes him sound like a villain from a fairy tale. But to his contemporaries, including his enemies, he was Ivan the Formidable, a ruler who broke a 300-year pattern of Russian subjugation to Mongol and Turkic powers. This doesn't excuse the massacres, the cultural destruction, the cruelty. But it reframes the question: was Ivan a monster, or was he exactly what his brutalized childhood and violent era created him to be? There's a medical theory about Ivan that's worth considering. A 2007 study suggested Ivan may have suffered from temporal lobe syndrome, with episodes of rage, mood changes, and a sense of personal fate associated with possible epilepsy. Others have suggested bipolar disorder. Whatever the clinical diagnosis, one thing is clear: the boy who was orphaned at 8 and terrorized by nobles until 16 grew into a man who couldn't tolerate the slightest hint of disloyalty. The Tsar who prayed in his tent while Kazan burned became the tyrant who would later create the Oprichnina, a state within a state, a secret police force that terrorized the very boyars he'd fought to control. Kazan didn't make Ivan terrible. It made him successful. And success, for a traumatized authoritarian, is the most dangerous drug of all. In Tatarstan, a memorial day is held each October to commemorate the fall of Kazan. In 2021 it was banned by the Russian government. 500 years later, the wounds still haven't healed. The empire that began with Kazan's conquest would eventually become the Soviet Union, which would eventually become modern Russia, a multi-ethnic state still grappling with the legacy of forced assimilation and cultural suppression that Ivan pioneered. The 150,000 soldiers who besieged Kazan weren't fighting 120,000 Mongol horsemen in a single battle, as the clickbait version might suggest. The real story is more complex and more devastating. They were crushing the last major fragment of the Golden Horde through a combination of technological superiority, ruthless determination, and systematic cultural destruction that played out over 6 weeks at Kazan and 4 more years in the countryside. But they did break a cycle. For the first time in Russian history, the raiders became the raided. The enslaved became the empire builders. And a traumatized orphan boy became the founder of a dynasty that would rule from the Baltic to the Pacific. Whether that trade was worth it, the death, the displacement, the transformation of Russia from a defensive principality into an aggressive empire, is a question Russians are still asking themselves today.